Yay, it's Friday and it is almost 2:30. I moved up the time a little bit just because my other class finished and I have some home computer issues, which I'm sure many of you can commiserate with, and I have to go call Dell and India and all that to figure them out. So I was hoping to get done a little early and be able to go home and sit on the phone and talk to people that can hopefully figure out my new computer and why it's not working. So here we get started. Week 3, Part 2, we have the digestive, respiratory, muscular organ systems, which per our course curriculum are topics we need to cover for anatomy and physiology and then pathologies. All right. In the previous lecture, it probably got started 2 minutes late because I had some issues with the talk function, but hopefully you've looked at cardiovascular and the immune system, and so this is just to finish up those those other organ systems. Realize I am blowing through this very, very quickly. If you take anatomy and physiology class, you spend weeks and weeks going through all of this, so you are just getting like the tip of the iceberg, but that's okay because this is a 100-level course, and I don't expect you to be anatomy and physiology experts at this point. Now, this material in this lecture is not in your book because your book doesn't really cover digestive, respiratory, or muscle problems. It kind of goes into sexual diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. So much of the material here is just gleaned from my A&P books and from my experience teaching pathology classes before, and that boundless ebook that I have you linking into for your ebook for this section of the course. Okay. So the digestive organ system. The digestive organ system is a big tube and some accessory features that add to and influence what goes on in the tube. The tube is known as the alimentary canal, and it starts at the mouth and ends at the anus. So different segments of the tube are going to have different characteristics because of what is going on chemically and what is going on physically within the tube to the food within that, whether it's chemically being digested or mechanically being broken down, and then whether it's absorption and secretion occurring. So the mouth is a big place for mechanical breakdown. So that's why you have teeth, tongue, the palate, and you pressing and moving and manipulating, and then you chemically start digesting in the mouth with your salivary glands. And your salivary glands have salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that helps break down complex carbohydrates into disaccharides that maltose. Okay. There is a little bit of lingual lipase that'll help bring the breakdown of fat, so break down some triglycerides into smaller free fatty acids and glycerol and some medium chain and some smaller chain fatty acids. But most of these items, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's just very small changes chemically. Most of the breakdown is done mechanically. There's no real protein digestion. There is a little bit of enzymes in the mouth to keep the mouth somewhat clean from items taking root and growing in there, and to constantly keep flushing dead and debris out and back into the other regions, or spitting out into the outside environment. The pharynx is the back of your throat. The pharynx is actually shared between both the respiratory and the digestive system. So the pharynx, the back of your throat, you'll have some tonsils there. You'll have basically the epiglottis and the larynx come off of it, and that is where the departure or the fork occurs, where you either go down into the lungs or down into the belly. The epiglottis is important because it keeps food from moving into the lungs, and it's the epiglottis that you have to get past when you want to, intubate somebody to get them attached to a ventilator or a mask and pump air into their lungs. You don't want to be pumping it into their stomach and making their stomach just distend with more air. All right, so the connection of the mouth and the pharynx to the stomach is through the esophagus. The esophagus is not going to play a huge role with digestion chemically because there's really no enzymes there. The lipase and the amylase might still be working to some extent. And mechanically, it's not going to do a lot because gravity is going to play a role here. And the goal is just to connect the opening of the tube, the opening of the alimentary canal, to a holding point in the stomach. The esophagus travels in the mediastinum, behind the heart and the lungs, in the thoracic cavity, and it crosses through the diaphragm and connects directly into the stomach. The stomach is a big holding site where you're going to do a lot of both chemical and mechanical digestion. The stomach is lined with lots of columnar epithelium, and they make a lot of these ridges, this rugae, and embedded in the deep parts of these ridges and hills and valleys are going to be these little pits, which are going to be glands. They are going to be where cells are that produce the hydrochloric acid that will break down proteins by breaking hydrogen bonds, because, again, things don't like to live in high acid environments. The acid will actually break down the salivary amylase and the lingual lipase from the mouth, so you'll stop some of that digestion from those molecules. You're going to have other enzymes, pepsinase, which is going to help. It's from pepsinogen. It becomes pepsin once exposed to the low pH environment, and that's going to break down, again, more proteins. So you really start protein digestion in the stomach. Okay? There's going to be lots of mechanical turning and churning and maneuvering of the stomach to keep the mixing going, so all the enzymes and the hydrochloric acid and the gastric juices can continually break bonds of molecules. There are bacteria that coexist in your stomach, as we'll learn later, and they are not problematic unless they get past the epithelial lining of your stomach and start getting housed in the connective tissue underneath, where they can potentially cause wounds and breaks and tears in the stomach, which we know as an ulcer. Okay? The stomach is going to slowly release smaller kind of samplings of what's food in your system of chyme, is what we call it, the mixture of stomach acid and juices and those molecules from your food that you've now broken down to smaller bits and pieces, and it's going to enter the small intestines. In the small intestines, there's going to be a lot more chemical breakdown with intestinal lipase, intestinal enzymes such as lactase, maltase, sucrase, galactase, to break down more of your carbohydrates. There'll be other protein breaking down enzymes. But the small intestines is also where we're going to get the secretions added from the pancreas, so pancreatic lipase, pancreatic amylase, pancreatic enzymes such as trypsin from trypsinogen, pepsinogen, chymotrypsin, and then the bile will come from the gallbladder and the liver in the form of bile salts and assist with emulsifying and mixing up and breaking down our fats, and then helping with fat absorption. Because remember, fats are not water friendly, and most of all of your body is water. So we have to get these fat molecules somewhat better mixed into the watery of our body and the solutions of our body, so it doesn't make little fat droplets and clog up things. Okay. The other thing that happens in the small intestines is we're going to absorb ions and vitamins and amino acids and nucleic acids, things to make all of our building blocks, whether that's DNA, RNA, proteins, fat, cholesterol, or carbohydrates, and how we maintain our water and our pressure gradients with sodium and potassium and chloride and calcium ions where they need to be. As you move through the parts of the small intestines, you end up in the large intestines, and the food that ends up in the large intestines is now going to be exposed to, again, some more bacteria that can help break it down because they have other different gene expression and enzymes. We'll reabsorb water here, and any of the bile, any of the maybe secretions that we don't want to keep, they'll become part of the poop of the fecal matter, as well as anything that's not absorbable, not useful to the system. Right? So that's basically the digestive system. A big long tube, mouth to anus. Accessories are salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder to store the bile made in the liver, and the pancreas, which makes hormones but makes a lot of secretions that are important in carbohydrate breakdown, protein breakdown, and fat breakdown. Okay? So this is just to reiterate some of the things I mentioned. So the mouth is where you get salivary amylase. That is an enzyme, it ends in ASC, that can break down carbohydrates. It typically breaks big carbohydrates like glycogen and starch into a disaccharide, maltose. And maltose then eventually gets broken down in the intestines by maltase, which is the enzyme, to glucose molecules. Right? The stomach, we see pepsin, we see hydrochloric acid. A lot of hydrochloric acid makes a very low pH. It can be down into the 2 range, 3 range. And just being in that low pH, that sometimes kills a lot of foodborne pathogens, so foodborne viruses, foodborne bacteria, because they can't live in those acidic environments. And it also helps us break down bonds that are in proteins and pathogens. Otherwise, we break down proteins, amino acid peptide bonds by pepsin. And so we start to liberate individual amino acids and make smaller peptide chains. The pancreas gives us pancreatic lipase to break down fat, pancreatic amylase, and then some chymotrypsin and trypsinogen, which are proteins. They break down proteins, just like pepsin, into individual amino acids. You also get some nucleases, which can break down DNA and RNA into the individual adenosine, guanine, thymine, uracil, those individual nucleic acids. The small intestines continues to add more, again, because the pancreas and the bile all come at the same point in the small intestines. So you do a lot of work in the early part of the small intestines with chemicals, and then you spend the rest of the small intestines, meaning why it's so large, on absorbing all of those individual molecules. And so you get lactase, sucrase, maltase to break down your disaccharides into glucose, fructose, and then absorb them. And you get your liver to help you with fats and fat handling, because we have to have fat in our diet. We have to have fat to make membranes. We have to have fat to make some hormones. We have to have fat to store fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin D and some of these other, vitamin K, so we can get clotting factors and get bone growth and development. So you have to have a little fat in your diet. You can't completely cut it out. Right? So what are some of the pathologies? Well, the whole reason dentists exist are to help deal with any tooth, gum, or diseases of the tooth and the gum, and potentially inability to chew and dissolve and break down mechanically food at the mouth. They also can, anything that has to do with cleft lips, cleft palates, that would inhibit the tongue's ability to press on the bone, and all of that potentially allowing food to be captured and held and viruses and bacteria to grow. So all of those things around the mouth, and the reason why dentists and orthodontists and different doctors exist, related to the mouth. Right? You have salivary glands. So one of the diseases that attacks and causes swelling and problems in a salivary gland is the mumps. It's a pathogen that actually will cause the parotid salivary gland to swell, and that's one of the symptoms of it. Now, that's not usually going to kill you, but that's just one of the symptoms of mumps, and there are other symptoms because that is a pathogen that attacks multiple places. But it's a very classic symptom of the mumps. We know the esophagus connects the stomach to the mouth. Well, the esophagus is a tube, and while it has a lower esophageal sphincter and an upper esophageal sphincter, if you gag or cough, or at times things can flow backwards inappropriately from the stomach into the esophagus and could potentially even, vomit. So any damage or any problems of that acid entering the esophagus and tearing away and destroying the lining and the cells could lead to GERD or heartburn or issues in the esophagus being damaged and pain receptors in and around that region being generated and stimulated. And because the pain stimulators are located near the heart and near the left arm and stuff, sometimes that pain can be mistaken for, heart attacks or heart problems. And it really is just acid reflux and nothing more than just inflammation in and around your digestive tract, but it's causing pain and it makes you feel like your heart's going to hurt and explode. Okay? All right, other pathologies as we continue down the tube, any inflammation in the stomach, any problem related to stomach, white blood cells attacking and problems, it's called a gastritis. So there are lots of different reasons you can end up with stomach inflammation, but you end up with gastritis. All right, ulcers are going to occur, and we always thought it was just too much acid. Well, the Nobel Prize went to this professor, this guy who discovered in the 80s that it actually isn't the acid that causes the ulcer, it's the acid tearing holes and into the epithelial tissue that allows bacteria to get into your stomach lining and then wreak havoc in your cells and in your tissues. So ulcers are really bacteria that because maybe you're overproducing acid, and maybe the acid is giving them an opportunity to get past a barrier that they normally shouldn't get past. Right? And stomach cancers can result of, again, you have epithelial cells. They're exposed to lots of pathogens from food or from swallowing or, mucus and capturing airborne pathogens. And it's epithelial. It's under a lot of stress of constantly being manipulated and turned and chyme tearing into it and acid production. So you might end up with stomach cancers. And in many cases, it links to high amounts of alcohol. Alcohol is absorbed in the stomach. That's why you drink and it gets to your system pretty quickly. Chewing tobacco, where you swallow those carcinogens into the stomach. And other diets where you're eating lots of heavily preserved foods can all lead to turning on of genes that would lead to the cells of the stomach becoming cancerous. And then you might have to have your stomach removed, the tumor removed, and then chemo and radiation treatments. Okay. Moving down into the intestines, anything that causes inflammation in the intestines would be an enteritis. And that can happen because of a lot of different reasons and mechanisms coming from the stomach into the intestines or the back leg, from the large intestines back towards the small intestines. Right? Pathologies, if you're not getting enough of the things you need in your diet and you are not digesting it appropriately, you could have a maldigestion, and so a deficiency. So think about lactose intolerant people. They can't drink milk, and the reason why they can't drink milk is they don't have lactase. Because they don't have lactase, anytime they introduce milk and milk fat products and milk sugars such as lactose, their body can't digest it, can't do anything with it, and so it causes them to end up with cramping and pooping and problems in their GI tract because they have something in it that they can't get rid of. All right? Crohn's disease is kind of like that. You end up with things like gluten problems. You can't eat and break down gluten, so you end up with all this digestion distress because you're lacking the ability to break it down. Right? Diverticulitis is more about inflammation of the large intestines. So a lot of times you see it happening in the regions closer to the anus and the rectum, and then as it gets more progressive, it moves towards the small intestines. And this is one of the things, if you have a lot of diverticulitis, a lot of inflammation, you might have problems in all of those epithelial polyp areas, and then you might start having higher risk for colorectal cancer. So when you get older and you start having colonoscopies, if they see a lot of inflammation in the colonoscopy, they might tell you to really look at your diet and add more fruits and vegetables and fibers and watch, because you might be setting yourself up for increased risk for colorectal cancer. Okay. Already kind of talked about Crohn's disease. Colorectal cancer, used to be very deadly because we wouldn't find it, but now with the mechanisms of having people take colonoscopies around, the age 40, 45, I think they're finding it earlier, and then if you have a risk of family, they even make you do colorectal exams earlier in life. Okay. Appendicitis. So this is still going to kill you if it ruptures. So appendix is a little extension off the large intestines near where the large and the small intestines come together. It's located in the inferior left quadrant of your body, and so a lot of times the right quadrant. So it's located down in the right hip area, and there's bacteria that lives in there, because there's bacteria that lives in your large intestines. So the reason why it's so deadly when it bursts is because it gives bacteria, which are technically housed inside the large intestines, so technically not inside your body, it gives them free reign to go take up residence in your abdominal pelvic cavity. And they can go hide around your liver, they can go hide around your kidneys, they can go hide around your stomach, they can go hide around your mesentery, and they start multiplying and growing, and you become septic and you die. And it's a nasty way to die. Plus you're having whole body inflammation and leakage and rupture and problems. So when people have pain and discomfort in their appendix, they immediately usually do surgery and remove it, and that way they don't let bacteria free reign in your abdominal pelvic cavity. Right? Ascites is another condition normally related to fluid accumulation in your belly. So this is where you end up with a problem with your solutes, your protein content, your solutes, your salts, your sodium, your chloride, potassium levels. And so because of that, you end up with, you can't get rid of those urea, ammonia, you can't get rid of sodium and chloride because your kidneys aren't working. And you can't get rid of it, and so your urine is not rich of waste products, and it's not getting rid of things. So those waste products and those solutes have to go somewhere. So they end up in and around the blood vessels around your mesentery, and they lead to the interstitial, the fluid of your abdominal pelvic cavity to swell, and so then you end up with fluid accumulating and the pressure building in your abdomen and problems with your GI tract. Okay? Sounds like fun, right? All those GI things. And that's just a little smattering. There are, of course, more, but those are some, like Crohn's disease you hear a lot about, diverticulitis, and that we do colorectal exams because of that and colonoscopies. All right, moving on to the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is kind of an interesting system. The main goal is to get to a place where a molecule in the atmosphere, oxygen, which is 2 oxygen atoms combined together. So it's O2. That's why it's O2. It's 2 molecules of oxygen combined together. Getting it into our body at a place where it can enter into the bloodstream, bind itself into molecules in the bloodstream, get to the tissues, get unbound from the blood and into the tissues, and used in cellular processes where it accepts hydrogens and electrons and forms the molecule water. Okay? And in the process of doing that, we generate carbon dioxide because we're breaking molecules that are carbon-carbon bonds, and we're making carbon dioxide in that, and we have to get rid of it. So the whole point of the system is to move air, and that's ventilate. Breathe air in and out, get air to the innermost deep regions of our system so some diffusion can occur of oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. Now, while it's not technically part of the respiratory system, the blood and your blood vessels transport the oxygen and the carbon dioxide to the cells, and then the cells are able to pull that oxygen off, release their carbon dioxide, and utilize through cellular respiration, cellular processes. They make energy, they get rid of all these hydrogens and electrons that they don't need, and they can survive and continue to propagate and move. All right? So the lungs are the 2 end features that house all these smaller little air pockets where blood and gas can interact. And getting air to move into those little air pockets and into the lungs is a process of ventilating and moving air from the upper respiratory system into the lower respiratory system. And you move about 500 milliliters of air every breath, and you take about 15 to 16 breaths a minute. Okay? And it's all done because of pressure. So some of the important pressures you have are atmospheric pressure, which if you look at the picture here at the bottom, atmospheric pressure is 760 milliliters of mercury. That means if you were to weigh the atmosphere and you weighed it by having a bowl of mercury sitting on the ground, the atmosphere would press on the mercury and make the mercury shoot up into a glass container 760 millimeters high. It's also like 29.92 inches if you want to make it English. Right? So that's the weight of the atmosphere stacked like mattresses on top of a scale. All right? In your lungs, to make air flow in, you cause yourself to inhale. And by inhaling, the diaphragm pulls down, the chest pulls out, and the volume in the lungs increases. And by Boyle's law, which is one of the laws you have to know, that means volume increases, pressure is going to inversely decrease. And with that happening, your inside or intrapulmonary or intraalveolar pressure is going to go to 757 millimeters of mercury. So now there's 3 millimeters of mercury difference between what's inside the lungs versus what's in the air. And that causes the air to want to move by diffusion from high to low, and air will flow into the lungs and exchange and interact with alveoli and blood in the alveoli. All right, so pressure gradient, same concept. All of a sudden your diaphragm relaxes and it moves back upwards, and the chest wall relaxes and it collapses down, and the chest thoracic cavity and the lungs volume-wise get smaller. So there's less size to this chamber. And as there's less size to this chamber, the air in there is going to be under higher pressure. And it's going to go up to 763 millimeters of mercury. And because of that, you are then going to have a gradient where it's high in the lungs, low outside, and air is going to move out. And so expiration, because no contractions occurred of muscle, it's considered passive, and inspiration is considered active. Now when you run, you might start using your abdominal muscles and your accessory like serratus anterior underneath, in your armpits, your pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, your levator, scapular muscles, and you might start compressing on your lungs, and that's when exhalation might become a little bit more active because muscles start squeezing and pressing on the lungs, and then inhalation may be a little bit more passive. But for the most part, inhalation from quiet, normal breathing is an active contraction of the diaphragm and intercostals, and exhalation is passive. Right? When you pressure breathe, so when you breathe on an oxygen mask, like in an airplane because you're flying really high, or in the spacesuit, pressure breathing, the pressure is added to when the air's being forced out through the mask, it flows with pressure, and so you have to try to relax your body and let that lung fill with air as it flows in with some pressure behind it. And then what you have to do is forcefully exhale, so you can exhale in an active mechanism and build up enough pressure to overcome the regulator in your mouth. Okay? Okay, so some of the major organs of the respiratory system, you have the nasal cavity, and there are speed bumps made by the bones called the nasal conchae, and the little tissue area in between, where those are sometimes known as the nasal meatuses. And the whole purpose here is there's a lot of mucousy membrane epithelial is to trap air particles coming in with the air. So trap the ragweed, trap the mold, trap the particulates that are related to coal and dust. And by trapping them, you don't bring them into the downstream regions and expose your body to pathogens or allergens. Right? But some of them get past. Right? The pharynx, again, part of this system, and the digestive. And the pharynx, and when we breathe, we're going to see at the larynx, the epiglottis going to be pulled up, and it's going to allow air to flow into our bronchi, and then eventually our primary and secondary, tertiary, quaternary, blah, 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 down into our small bronchioles and our airways and our alveoli. Okay? All right, you can breathe through your mouth, but you tend to associate the mouth with digestion and the nose with respiratory. The upper respiratory system is everything basically at this dividing line of the pharynx up. And your larynx is, in addition to where you switch and only enter into the lungs, it's also where your voice box and your specialized cartilage that will form, your cricoid and your thyroid cartilage will form into a vibrating area that allows you to make sounds for speech. Okay, so people that have cancer in the larynx and their voice nodules, they lose maybe some of their speaking, or their speaking becomes a little bit more nasally or changes as they damage or have to cut in and redo the larynx. Okay. All right, so one of the functional tests you do is pulmonary function testing with the lungs. And what you want to see in pulmonary function testing is, can the person breathe normal amounts of air, and can they breathe out normal amounts of air, and can they make their reserve or their deep breaths be in a normal range, and can they blow out a normal range of air, and can they blow out a normal range of air in a certain period of time. And by looking at these things and knowing your age and your height and your gender and about what you should be in a normal population, we can tell you if you are in a state of lung disease, of restriction, or obstructive conditions. Right? And so this, and I make my students in A&P memorize this, so it is important, and I will ask you to try to learn all your volumes and your capacities. Right? So when you quiet breathe, when you just sit here listening to me talk, and you just let your diaphragm, maybe in your little bit of intercostal contractions, be your only source of muscle contraction and breathing in, you're doing what's known as resting breathing. Resting quiet breath. And the air that you're moving is known as your tidal volume. And it's right here. And like I said earlier, it's about 500 milliliters of air are going to move in and out of your mouth. And of that 500 milliliters of air, a portion of it will then get towards the alveoli and interact with the blood. The rest of it's going to be somewhat in the passageways. And with every next breath, you're going to constantly kind of do a shift and a flush, and more of the air that was in the alveoli is going to come out, and the air in between is going to enter in, and then you're going to add fresh air to the system. Okay? Now, we know when we're quietly breathing, we're not breathing in all the air we possibly can. Okay? So if we were quiet breathing and we told someone to take a big, deep breath, right? And we asked them to increase the amount of air to take as much air in as they can. The air above what they would breathe from tidal volume to the maximum amount of air they can enter is known as your inspiratory reserve volume. Right? So this is when you ask someone, take a really big, deep breath for me. Take it all in. Take as much as you can. You're asking them to take in their inspiratory reserve. So what they're capable of adding in when they add in more accessory muscles to inhale. Okay? And expand their lungs as much as possible. If you ask them to blow out as much as they can from a quiet breath, you're asking them to blow out with the help of abdominal muscles and maybe even crouching over and squeezing their lungs, making their thoracic cavity smaller. You're asking them to breathe out their expiratory reserve volume. Now, one of the things to note is that no matter how much you try, no matter how much force and how much squeezing you do on your lungs, you should never, ever be able to squeeze out every single molecule of air. There should always be molecules of air somewhat in the nose, somewhat in the mouth, somewhat in the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, keeping the airways open. And that volume that's always left in your lungs is known as your residual volume. So those are your three volumes, right? You have tidal volume, what you move in a normal quiet breath. You have the inspiratory reserve, what you are capable of taking in if you take a bigger involved breath, what you're capable of blowing out if you add in accessory squeezing and pressing and condensing on your lungs, and the air that no matter how much you try is always left in your lungs, the residual volume. Okay? Now, capacities are going to be two or more volumes together. So the first capacity is how much air do you take, how much air is your body capable of taking in? So your inspiratory capacity reflects two volumes that involve an inhale. You have an inhale in the tidal volume, and you have an inhale in your inspiratory reserve volume. So inspiratory capacity is the amount of air you would be able to inhale should you ever try. And it can be somewhere, all right, of 500 to 1900, all right, in females, and in males, it might be a little bit more, okay? Right? Now, the other big capacity is the vital capacity. So this is how much air are you moving, are you capable of moving for being alive. So it's the inspiratory capacity, that tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, plus the expiratory reserve. So this capacity represents you being able to move air all the way in and all the way out. And so the only thing not represented in your vital capacity is your residual volume, the air that's always left when you blow out. Okay? Your functional residual capacity is going to be when you're quiet, normally breathing, what you normally leave in your lungs. And it's normally a bigger volume than if you do a forceful exhale. So your functional residual capacity is your expiratory reserve volume and your residual volume. And then all four volumes added together are your total lung capacity. And in females, your total lung capacity is around 4.2 liters or 4,200 milliliters, and in guys it can be as big as 6 liters or 6.6000 milliliters. Okay? Now, when we do functional testing, the old school way is you breathe into a device and a pin moves on a graph sheet of paper and you get these volumes. The new way to do it is you breathe into this little computer device and it will not only give you capacities and functions, but it will tell you when you are exhaling, what amount of blood or air just flows in the first second, what amount of air flows in the first 25 percentage of time you're exhaling, and then the next 50% of the time of you exhaling. And so you get a lot better idea of not only the movement of the air, but the timing of when most of it is moving. And then you can get better ideas of where potentially is obstructions or where potentially are resistances being encountered in the airway. Is it up front or is it deeper in? Okay. All right, so I've already kind of hit on Boyle's law. That's the what I call back in my Air Force days, we called it the balloon law. All right, it's the law that says pressure and volume are inversely related. So anytime that pressure goes up, volume is going down, or if volume goes up, pressure comes down. So we called it the balloon theory, and we used to tell people, all right, so this is you going in an altitude environment, and you just had a bean burrito. And a bean burrito being digested in your digestive tract is going to make a lot of gas, methane gas, that you're going to want to fart out. All right? But if you don't fart out and you keep that methane gas in your GI tract, when you get to 18,000 feet, because the pressure in 18,000 feet high is half of what it is at sea level, your gas of your burrito being digested is now doubled, because if pressure went down, the volume has doubled. So it's pushing twice as much on your tubing. If you let it go until 26,000 or 25,000 feet, now you're at a third of an atmosphere, which is a third of the pressure, and your gas is now 3 times, and that can start to hurt. And if you go to 34,000 feet, you're at a quarter of an atmosphere. So now the pressure is a quarter of what it was at sea level, and you're at 4 times the gas. And so you see my point of when you're flying and you eat bean burritos or gas-making foods, go ahead and fart small amounts constantly. Otherwise, you might end up in a lot of serious pain with fart material in your GI tract. Okay? The other place we see this is in your ear, along with your lungs. Your inner ear, this is why your ears go clickety-clack when you go up in altitude. As you go up in altitude, the pressure is decreasing, the volume and the in the middle ear is expanding, so you try to equalize it, and your ears are going to click and clack. As you come down and the pressure starts to increase, the volume decreases, and you create a little vacuum in your ear, and that's why it hurts, and that's why you have to kind of blow and valsalva and cough and force air into the middle ear. And you see it also with diving. So when you ever scuba dive, you'll learn how to valsalva and clear your ears and clear your mask, because again, you're undergoing Boyle's law. Okay. Now Henry's law, we call it the Coke bottle law. This is all about what gases are in your body, and this usually relates to oxygen and carbon dioxide, because that's the gas we worry about. It's directly proportional to the partial pressure of the gas on top. All right. So what we're saying here is, when you drink your soda, and maybe you have a soda in front of you, it's carbonated. All right. When they made the soda, they put a little environment where they made the top of the pressure of carbon dioxide gas really high, and that helped force and dissolve all this carbon dioxide into the solution. All right? And then they sealed it. And then when you pop the top and open and break the seal, now there's like 2 or 3% carbon dioxide molecules dissolved in that liquid, but the atmosphere is at less than 1%. And so you have a pressure gradient, and it makes a bubble. Okay, this happens with oxygen. So oxygen pressure, there is some oxygen that gets dissolved. So if I put you on an oxygen mask and I put you at a hyperbaric chamber, so I put you at equivalent to 3 atmospheres in a chamber, you're going to have more oxygen get dissolved in your blood, and you're going to carry more oxygen in your blood as a dissolved gas to your tissues. Okay, same thing with carbon dioxide. Right, and so this is Henry's law is really big in diving, and it's really big related to nitrogen, because nitrogen is a filler gas. But when we expose ourselves to higher levels of nitrogen, we take on more nitrogen in our system. And then when we go and fly airplanes and go to high altitude very quickly, we can potentially start to see that nitrogen gas come out of solution and cause the bends and decompression sickness. Okay? But mostly with Henry's law, it's helping us get oxygen into our blood independent of hemoglobin. And it helps us get some carbon dioxide into our blood independent of hemoglobin and chemical reactions. Right? And the last gas law is Dalton's law. And this law states that the total pressure of all of our gases in an atmosphere are going to be the total pressure is the sum of all those components, those partial pressures. So like our picture shows down here, this is air. So there should be some little equal signs right here. What you breathe, air, is a combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and potentially all these other things in the atmosphere. A little bit of water, a little bit of carbon dioxide, a little bit of argon, a little bit of helium, a little bit of carbon monoxide, a little bit of freon, a little bit of whatever's in the atmosphere. Okay? And so you add them up. And then when you breathe in, you're going to actually manipulate your partial pressures. If you're in an arid environment and there's not a lot of humidity, you're going to add more humidity. You're going to humidify your air. And you're going to add more carbon dioxide. Okay? So the partial pressure is always going to be related to what are the components. If I go on a 100% oxygen and I mask my face and I start only breathing what's coming out of the 100% oxygen tube, my partial pressure of oxygen equals my total pressure because I'm only taking in my oxygen. Right? And then conversely, if I start diving with nitrox, nitrox gas means you're going to dive with a solution of gas that nitrogen's not as high as it is in the atmosphere. And it allows you to take on less nitrogen when you're at depth, so you're less likely to get the bends, and you can stay down at the depths looking around at shipwrecks and animals and coral longer. Okay? So there are ways we manipulate, gas when we give gas to people. But for the most part, this is important because the atmosphere is different from what is the gas content in your lungs. You humidify and you have more dead air space, so you have more carbon dioxide in the air in your lungs than you do in the atmosphere. And so because of that, if the atmosphere started out with 160 millimeters of partial pressure of gas, oxygen gas in the atmosphere, once it gets down to your lungs, you're down to 100 millimeters of mercury pressure. So at sea level, the ideal conditions, our body is set up to where we breathe in air with 160 millimeters of oxygen in it, partial pressure, but when it gets to our lungs, it's down to 100. And that's fine because that gives us 98% saturation and some dissolved oxygen, and we survive. Where it becomes problematic is go watch Everest. When they get above 18,000 feet, half an atmosphere, they start to act a little crazy. They start to make poor decisions because instead of the atmosphere being at 160, it's at 80. Well, now in the lungs, they're down to like 60 millimeters of pressure. So the lungs still have to be less than the atmosphere because you add in more water and more carbon dioxide. Okay? So when they got up to 26,000 feet and all the bad things started happening on Everest, again, you're at a place where you don't have a lot of oxygen. What you do have is being in competition, and some of it's going away because you have to humidify and you have residual volume, so it's carbon dioxide rich. That's why you can't just fly a helicopter up there without acclimating to Everest. Nobody's going to fly a helicopter and jump out and be on the top of Everest. It's not possible because you would immediately start to pass out and die and lose oxygen with every breath you take. Okay? So those are our gas laws. And they are going to influence, in many cases, why we ventilate, how often we ventilate, and what's happening in the blood, tissue, blood-air interactions. Okay, so oxygen is our key molecule we want to get in, and we carry oxygen in two ways, right? So over here, let's see, oxygen comes in, and per Henry's law, some of it stays dissolved in the plasma. So that's Henry right there telling us some of it's going to stay dissolved in the plasma. The rest of it's going to, as this arrow shows, head in, bind to hemoglobin, and form what's known as carboxyhemoglobin. And this is where 98% of our oxygen is bound, so we can constantly keep a gradient of pulling more oxygen in every time blood's moving through the lungs. Right? When you get to the tissues, all right, the oxygen is going to be offloaded into the tissues because they have low oxygen amounts. Their partial pressure is at 40, and in the blood, It's at 95 millimeters of pressure. Okay, it was at 100, remember, in the lungs. And it dropped off, and now it's even lower. And so all that oxygen comes back and becomes oxygen plus hemoglobin and flows into the tissues, and some of that oxygen dissolved in the plasma flows into the cells. Okay? Carbon dioxide, of course, a little bit more challenging and a little bit more, let's just say, unique in terms of how it's carried. So carbon dioxide has 3 arrows. It is carried in the blood in 3 ways. Some of it, according to Henry's law, is dissolved in plasma. The rest of it is going to be in the red blood cell like oxygen, most of oxygen, and it's going to be bound or chemically changed because of chemical molecular interactions with other ions and other molecules into something else. So some of carbon dioxide in the presence of this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, is going to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid in water dissolves into a hydrogen and bicarb. That's why it's an acid. This is why carbon dioxide is sometimes known as an acid, even though you look at carbon dioxide and you're like, I don't see any hydrogens in it. Well, why? When it combines with water, it forms a molecule that donates an acid to the water and the solution around it. And because it does that, it's an acid, right? And this is how majority, so up to like 70% of your carbon dioxide travels and changes and gets a ride in your blood cells and in your blood. It moves and becomes an acid, and then it moves and becomes a bicarb and a hydrogen ion. Okay, about 23 or about 30%, so less. The rest of it is going to be this, but the second highest way is oxygen vacated a seat, vacated a binding spot, and carbon dioxide, while it's not the exact same molecule as just an oxygen molecule because there's a carbon attached to it, it still is O2. There is an O2 component, so that is somewhat able to bind to hemoglobin, and it forms carbon amino hemoglobin and can hitch a ride bound to hemoglobin. Right? And so when we set up conditions in the respiratory system in the lungs, low carbon dioxide in the air, low carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that helps pull carbon dioxide out of the body. Low oxygen in the body, that helps high oxygen in the air, that helps pull it in. Okay? And everything about ventilation, those gas laws, is about helping to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. So most of your pathologies are going to be related to somehow you're not getting good air exchange between the air, blood, and good gas exchange. And so any acute or chronic condition that stops or hinders flow of pulmonary ventilation is going to be a pathological state. So bronchitis, when you have an inflammatory response in your airways between the trachea and the alveoli, the bronchi and the bronchioles, that's going to maybe produce a cough and some pain and occlude the airway, and less air gets in, less air gets to the alveoli, so you would have a potential less oxygen being delivered to your tissues. Pneumonia occurs by a bacteria causing the lungs to start fill with interstitial fluid. And so if the alveoli become full of water, extracellular water, they're not air exchanging with blood. And so part of pneumonia's problem is, yeah, it's a bacterial infection, and you have fever, and you have chills, and you have pain, and you have a cough. But the big crisis is your lungs are filling with water. And if they're filling with water, there's less oxygen gas, oxygen, carbon dioxide, blood, gas, air in exchange. Okay? And you can have a lot of reasons to get pneumonia. Tuberculosis just starts to eat away and break apart and tear away your alveoli, so you lose surface area and you lose air-gas interchange, air-gas-blood interactions. And again, it's bacteria. Other types of restrictive pulmonary diseases, you inhibit inspiration. So you have things that reduce your amount of lung. So you have fibrosis or asbestos or coal or silicone exposures, or you have some type of injury that you damage a part of the lungs, a mechanical injury, right? Obstructive, there's a lot of different ways you can obstruct the airways. So COPD gets a lot of its chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. You can have that because you smoke a lot and progressing to you just have irreversible obstructions, irreversible changes in the lungs and the airways that doesn't allow air to flow out. And so your residual volumes start to increase, and it leads to breathing difficulties. Long-term chronic bronchitis, again, you have that excessive mucus and deep cough, and you have difficulty getting air out. Emphysema, you have air trapped in the alveoli. Again, it can occur because you've been exposed to like farming, agriculture toxins, and you've torn up and tore away your lungs, and your air sacs enlarged, and then they become useless, and air stays trapped in your lungs. And then asthma is a short-term obstructive disease because you get exposed and the over-hypersensitivity of your immune system. And your airways, your bronchioles seize up and the airway gets really small. And so and a variety of reasons can trigger that because allergies can happen and allergies can trigger asthma. All right, our muscular organ system, we focus on our skeletal system. So your skeletal muscles, they are cells capable of contractions, and they generate movement. So any problem that results in inability for the muscle to be told to contract by the nervous system, inability for those muscles to undergo the cellular changes that lead to actin and myosin protein interactions can cause issues, or any problems with ATP being made and expended and being housed. Okay? So the role of the organ system is to produce heat, produce movement, and maintain our posture. So some simple pathologies that can occur are just little damage anatomically to the organ itself, the skeletal muscle. You can have trauma and overexertions and overstretching, which would lead to strains. So nothing is torn away from the bone or disassembled. It's just there's micro tears and there's micro in the collagen around and the elastin and the connective tissue around the muscle, or the muscle maybe is swollen a little bit because it's taken in more fluids than it should, and so it's a little bit of a strain. A sprain is more of an injury to the joint and ligament and tendon, the point of attachment, and it can even lead to inflammation in and around that joint, and there will be the entire inflammatory response of swelling and fever and heat. And cramps are, again, for some whatever reason, the muscles are trying to contract and they're doing it inappropriately and it becomes painful. And so it might be because of a mess up between the ions, sodium, potassium, and calcium. Okay? So almost any other pathology of the skeletal muscle system really involves the skeletal muscle system cannot move, so you have problems with movement, or you have problems with muscle control, and you have problems with your paralysis, all right? And the reason why it's a skeletal muscle pathology and not a neurological pathology is the paralysis, the muscle control, is the problem originates in the skeletal muscle. So while MS, while ALS, while a lot of your pathologies of the neurological system affect muscles and can cause paralysis of muscles, technically the muscles, there's nothing wrong with them. They're just not being told to contract effectively and efficiently by the nervous system. So they would be a neurological issue. So we really don't have a lot of muscle pathologies unless you're born with some type of gene or genetic deficiency to some protein inside the muscle that's critical for actin and myosin interaction and sliding filament theory. Okay, so muscular dystrophy is one of these big groups of muscles where there's a muscle in the skeletal muscle, a protein, I'm sorry, that is genetically wrong. And because it's genetically wrong, it messes with the muscle, skeletal muscle, and its ability to contract. And so the nervous system tells muscle to contract, it releases acetylcholine, but the muscle cells can't do it, so you have a paralysis that occurs. Right? And the most common form is actually Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And so what ends up happening is the lack of these muscle cells being able to contract means they're useless and they're going to atrophy and they're going to die because they don't have this one specific gene. And they'll be replaced by fat tissue and connective tissue. And in doing so, you end up losing with time paralysis and you don't even have muscle to contract and use. Okay? Myasthenia gravis is another type of muscle weakness in your face, in your throat, and again it's because, and it's really bad if it gets in your diaphragm and your intercostals because now you can't move and generate pressure changes in the lungs. right? And so it's an autoimmune disease, and it attacks muscle cells, and it affects the muscle cells where the neuron speaks to them. So you start to make the muscle cell inactive and unable to respond to acetylcholine from the motor neuron. And so the motor neuron is working, but the muscle cell doesn't work. And so there's a mess up there, and it leads to potentially short-term and long-term paralysis or unuse or weakness, and that can be bad when you can't breathe. Okay? And again, MS, ALS, all these other ones, it's a neurological issue. The problem is with the neurons, but because the neurons are not working, the motor neurons, muscle's not told to contract. Now, smooth muscles are usually found lining all of your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, like the bronchioles are lined with smooth muscle. And so any problems usually involving these cells are usually associated with the pathology of that organ system that the muscle is lining. So a problem with your stomach being able to mix chyme is a digestive problem, not necessarily a smooth muscle problem. So that's why I mention it here, just to remind you that mostly pathology is related to smooth muscle. So if your sphincter doesn't work, your external sphincter of your urethra, that's a urinary problem, and you go see a urologist usually. If your sphincter in your anus doesn't work, again, you don't really go see skeletal muscle people. You go see your general surgeon to go, or maybe your OG to fix your muscle in your anus. All right? All right, that is it, you guys. I will send out your reminder for the end of the week. Don't forget your quiz. Don't forget your worksheet. Have questions, email, or send me open forum comments. Have a great week, and I will be in touch with you guys Monday with grading, and then next week another Blackboard session. Onward. Here we go.